Hello everyone and welcome to the URBIS Dialogues, webinar number 4. We will start within a minute. Thank you. Hello everyone and welcome to the URBIS Dialogues, webinar number 4. I'm David Maddox, founder and editor-in-chief of The Nature of Cities and chair of the URBIS Advisory Board. If you've never used GoToWebinar before, we welcome your questions and look for a questions section on your control panel, and you can ask the panel questions by typing them in, and we will answer them toward the end of this seminar. Today's webinar is Ecosystem Services Part 1, Analyzing the Current Condition of the City, brought to you by the Urban Biosphere Initiative, or URBIS. URBIS is a global network connecting acclaimed scientific researchers, foresighted policymakers, visionary planners, and environmental practitioners from across the world, partnering with local governments to share, develop, and implement ideas for creating more resilient and equitable urban regions. Our advisory board and partners are shown on the screen here. A diverse set. Please go to our website shown on the screen to visit more about, to learn more about URBIS and the webinar series. The URBIS Dialogue is a 15-part webinar series, global platform for online dialogue. It's held the first Thursday of every month and archived for repeated viewing. It brings together representatives from cities and local governments and leading experts from around the world, sharing experiences and to address specific urban challenges focusing on the sustainable use of regional biodiversity and ecosystem services, all in the service to support social development in a rapidly urbanizing world. The next webinar will take place the first Thursday in September, titled Citizen Participation and Stewardship. Whose Earth is it anyway? Led by Fleur Tenor from London. Now you notice I said Ecosystem Services Part 1. There will be a number of dialogues, URBIS dialogues involving addressing the idea of ecosystem services. This is the first one. And we're going to take a broad view of ecosystem services because there are severe challenges of open space and loss of urban nature in the rural cities. Those take many forms, from livability, picture of the street scene in Mumbai, livability, pollution, that's a picture of a canal in New York City, and the poor dolphin that swam into it. Justice around the idea of the distribution of environmental bads and pollution, but also the access to environmental goods such as parks. Inequality, resilience, the classic one we talk about in terms of ecosystem services, and so on. Now the good news is that there are a number of ecosystem services and nature-based solutions that can address many of these problems. And that's what we want to start talking about today from a very broad point of view. So in the classic sense, how would we assess and measure these in terms of conceptually, but also in terms of specific tools? And these are things we'll be talking about today. Classically, things that have gotten a fair amount of attention, such as bioswales or green spaces like this that serve have ecosystem services such as stormwater collection, but also beautification, resilience. This is a picture of Jamaica Bay that to some extent protects New York City from storm. Ecosystem services such as the provisioning of biodiversity, flamingos in Mumbai, but also other kinds of ecosystem services that move into the social realm, such as community gardens, such as this one in Kampala, or tree planting programs around the world, this one in Cape Town. Parks, in this case a pop-up park in Christchurch after the earthquake. Parks in Singapore and in New York City. So that is the purpose of today's webinar, to take a broad view of biophysical, biodiversity-based, and social ecosystem services. We have 3 speakers today. First is Timon McPherson, professor at the New School, who will be talking about biophysical ecosystem services and tools. Lena Chan from the National Parks Board in Singapore, and Linda Campbell from the U.S. Forest Service in New York City. Let's start with Timon McPherson. Dr. Timon McPherson is an assistant professor at of urban ecology at the New School's Environmental Studies program, director of the Urban Ecology Lab, and research faculty at the Tishman Environment and Design Center, where he works directly with designers and planners and managers to foster sustainable and resilient cities. He investigates the ecology in, of, and for cities and teaches urban resilience, systems thinking, and urban ecology at the university. Timon is a founding member of the Italy Urban Biosphere, URBIS initiative, the process we're talking about today, and a contributing author to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity's Cities Biodiversity Outlook, a member of the Urban Climate Change Research Network, and co-leads Future Earth Urban Platform. His work is published widely, including in scientific journals such as Nature, Ambio, Urban Ecosystem Landscape, and Urban Planning, and in books, and covered in the New York Times, The Nation, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and more. He is co-PI of the 5-year, $12 million Urban Resilience to Exchange Sustainability Research Networks, funded by the U.S. Science Foundation. I'm also proud to say he's a writer for the Nature of Cities. Please welcome Timon McPherson.
Thank you, David. Can you hear me okay? I hope so. Thanks, everyone, for participating today. It's really a pleasure to be able to talk with you, and thank you for ICLEI and URBIS for hosting this webinar. I'm really excited to have a chance to talk with the other panelists here and to answer questions that you may have, and in general be part of the larger discussion. So David and URBIS asked me to talk a little bit about methods and approaches from the biophysical perspective, so I'm going to do that as very briefly, just in 10 or 12 minutes here. In general, I'm assuming that most of the participants here are starting with the idea that there is high potential for nature-based solutions to a number of the challenges and problems that David outlined, from issues of social inequity and access to the kinds of benefits that nature can provide, to climate change challenges, development, pollution, many of the kinds of challenges that we have. And not everything is gray, and one of the things we've been finding in both research and practice is that even small-scale interventions can have potentially high impact. So what, in general, we're talking about is moving away from traditional hard infrastructural solutions to some of the challenges that we face to safer, more flexible, softer kinds of infrastructure that we might call anything from nature-based solutions to ecosystem services to natural capital, et cetera. But these kinds of solutions can be very flexible, and the last bullet point there can be very multifunctional. So in terms of thinking about the goals that we have for the nature that we have in cities, one of the goals is that they be multifunctional and to really take advantage of the fact that nature can provide multiple kinds of functions, and therefore, in the case of where they benefit humans, multiple kinds of benefits. Additionally, I'm hoping everyone can hear me. For some reason it went quiet on in my earbuds. We have goals about social inequity and access, and we also have goals about how to build resilience and what kinds of things that ecosystems can do in terms of helping us to build resilience. But there's still the lack of assessment and valuation in planning and policy making, management, and other kinds of decision makings in cities. But I think there's still a need for tools and methods to help input into those decision-making processes, the real value of urban nature. One of the things that we have seen when decision makers take cost benefit type analyses to look at the comparison of green strategies versus gray strategies. For example, in New York City, for a single benefit for capturing stormwater, we found that the green infrastructure can save, in this case, $1.5 billion over traditional gray infrastructure strategies. And so these kinds of solutions can be incredibly cost effective. And I pointed out here that this was for a single benefit, and yet one of our goals here is really about multiple benefits, right? One of the classic cases here is, of course, trees, which cities around the world have taken up the example of trees to plant trees in urban context especially because of their multifunctionality, their ability to provide both mental and physical health benefits, as well as regulating services like reducing stormwater or providing shade for cooling or reducing air pollution and noise pollution, etc. And yet at the same time, there are many other kinds of infrastructure. One of my colleagues in Berlin, Dagmar Haas, has been looking at the potential for green roofs, for example, to reduce air pollution, to cool buildings, to reduce stormwater, and provide additional recreational space in the city. This is obviously a simulated photo that you're looking at, but when you calculate the potential benefits, the numbers can be extremely high. So this sort of underlies both the potential as well as thinking about how do we calculate those benefits and how can we help as researchers and practitioners to incorporate that into decision making. There's a couple points I want to make before show you some examples of those kinds of calculations. One is that ecosystem services are not just produced by natural systems, but they're produced by nature and people. So this co-production is critical to recognize and critical, I think, to examine how do we take a socio-ecological perspective in our assessment, in our management activities, in the kinds of plans and designs that we make in cities, so that they take advantage of the fact that these systems are co-produced by people and nature. The other, and I just point out that we've had some really great fun working with local residents in New York City where I live really trying to get at that social side of the socio-ecological production of ecosystem services, trying to help people see the potential that they have and the role that they have to play also as stewards of that nature. Some of the kinds of methods we're working on are to pioneer some new ways to take advantage of existing data, and I bring this up just to mention that we'll talk about data I expect a bit more, and the kinds of data that can be leveraged to help us understand both the social input to both the production, management, and stewardship of ecosystems for these kinds of benefits, as well as the ecological side. The other point I wanted to make is that ecosystem services, the production of those services, is dependent on multiple kinds of contexts. It's dependent on people, as I mentioned. It's dependent on the ecosystems actually performing those ecosystem functions. It's often dependent on technical infrastructure. And in many cases, it's even dependent on a problem existing in the first place. For example, the potential service of a wetland to clean up heavy metals in water is dependent on the problem being there in the first place, which could come and go and has a temporal element to it. For example, in a recent paper we did led by Eric Anderson at the Stockholm Resilience Center and myself, we looked at typology of these kinds of context dependencies of ecosystem services and broadly broke them into those 4 categories. And at the top you can see, for example, with food, the context there is that it takes people and human labor to produce food. It takes technical infrastructure, machinery to produce food, as well as the ecosystem. So I just wanted to emphasize that when we think about both how we calculate the benefits of ecosystems, we have to be, and as well as how we manage them, we have to be thinking about these multiple kinds of interdependent relationships between the social, the ecological, and the technical. And in the case here of temperature regulation, such as urban heat island mitigation, the other one I've highlighted, again, there it's sort of it's a problem situation. On cool days, it's not such a benefit. On very hot days, like we're having this week in New York City, the green infrastructure provides incredible benefits. So I want to just show a couple examples of the kinds of calculations that we've been doing to look at different ecosystem services, as well as what's out there in the literature in terms of additional tools, and then we can follow up with some questions as needed. So we've started, like a lot of researchers, using land cover data, land use data, other kinds of ecological data to calculate multiple kinds of ecosystem services in terms of assessing them, mapping them, and providing a valuation framework to help decision makers think about how that value might vary over the urban landscape. So in a particular study that's in review right now and should be out shortly, we hope, we've taken soil, land cover, land use data to calculate a number of different ecosystem services. And I don't have time to really talk through those methods in general, in detail, but I can show you where to find them, and I'm happy to, over email, send papers with methods around to people if that's helpful. In this particular study, we looked at 5 different ecosystem services, regulating services, such as local cooling, recreational services, sort of cultural services, such as recreation, and other services. And one of the things that we've done here is for each of these different services, of course, there's a different set of methods behind the actual assessment of how that benefit, how much benefit there is at a particular point in time, at a particular place. So if you look at, for example, in the upper left, stormwater runoff mitigation, we've used hydrological models and various runoff curve numbers to estimate how much a particular landscape, whether it's bare soil in a vacant lot, whether it's a forest in the city that has high canopy cover, or some other kind of ecological situation, how much stormwater is it absorbing for a particular kind of storm event. We've done similar kinds of things, but of course the calculations are different for each service for calculating how much a particular green place in the city provides cooling, both using evapotranspiration estimates, shading potential, etc. Now this work has been done at 1 meter resolution for the entire city, so even though we're looking at sort of a city-wide sort of view here, there's the ability with this approach to take it from any particular neighborhood scale or small scale situation. So a neighborhood or local community organization would be able to use these kinds of values to help make decisions about the kinds of benefits that they would want to prioritize. And one of the reasons I wanted to focus on multifunctionality, on multiple benefits, is because when you can look at multiple benefits, then we can start addressing some of these questions that have come up, and we're hearing them come up in cities all around the world from managers and planners who want to maximize the benefits for a particular investment, which means we need to understand potential trade-offs where some benefits might be easier to achieve than others, and how we might really examine what those trade-offs might look like for a particular location in a particular place and time. Additionally, this kind of approach allows us also to look at how the benefits vary over space. And what's not easy to see in this, but if you zoom in, you can see, is that if you look across different parts of the city, you see that not all green infrastructure is the same. Some performs better for air pollution than others. Some performs better for cooling the city than other kinds of green infrastructure. And this is an active area of research, is to really try to understand what are the components and configurations of ecosystems that can help cities maximize the kinds of benefits that they get out of different investments. I haven't talked much about valuation. This is a non-monetary valuation framework where the different services have been scored from 0 to 100, and in this map that we're looking at, they're stacked on top of each other just to give an overview of how the city might look at the variation in benefits that are currently being provided by the ecosystems in the city. If you zoom in, for example, to a particular area, you can see, depending on the kind of values and priorities given to that valuation rankings, and I'm again skipping over methodological detail, but happy to answer questions, you can see how those values might change. Now, this requires lots of different kinds of data. Some cities are more data rich than others. Some cities have very high resolution data, other coarser data. This is something that we need to deal with in terms of better understanding what we can do in a particular urban context. So I just mentioned some of the common kinds of data here that we've used and other researchers are using, which is to rely on local ecological data and biodiversity information, which I believe Lena will talk about some more, land use and land cover data, but also because of the interplay between the social elements, the people in the city, and how important they are to both the production and management of ecosystem services. Socioeconomic and demographic data and other kinds of data are really critical here to have as well when thinking about assessment and valuation. So I'll just mention a couple tools and approaches that exist, and then I'll stop. One of the things that we have been seeing is that there isn't really a standalone tool that everyone around the world can just grab and have their ecosystems assessed and their values generated in a couple clicks. I mean, urban systems are complex and local situations are important. So we definitely think that there's really no one-size-fits-all solution, but there are some tools that people are using. So I'll just mention these briefly and then talk about a bit of the pros and cons. iTree is developed by the USDA Forest Service and is now used by thousands of researchers and practitioners around the world. It's primarily focused on forests, and it's one of the reasons that we've been working to develop some of our own methods for assessment and value. That I wanted to make sure that everyone's aware of this software suite because it has high value for and has been very successful in terms of motivating local policymakers and planners to invest in urban forest as a multifunctional solution to a number of the challenges and problems that are being used. The Natural Capital Project, run out of Stanford University, has developed a software we called Invest. It has 15 different modules. Now, this is not like iTree, it's not focused on urban areas, and that's actually one of the problems perhaps with INVEST, is that it's not really tailored for urban situations. However, at regional scale, some of those modules like coastal flood protection and some of the other modules within that modeling suite may, for some of the participants here, be useful, and so I'd encourage people to at least look at it. Another tool, not specifically about ecosystem services, but just useful to kind of point out, developed in Manchester in the UK, is called the STAR tool. And here, this helps generate surface temperature data. So for cities who are really thinking about how can we maximize ecosystems for cooling the city, you need surface temperature data to really look at the correlations between how green infrastructure and temperature vary across space in the city. And so this is a potential tool for generating that kind of information, and similar for looking at water. So they've been very focused with heat and water. And finally, something relatively new is the framework that has been developed for the US federal government. Again, this is like the INVEST program. This is not urban specific, but has a number of guidelines, frameworks, and actual tools in this very extensive guidebook that's prepared for the federal government for all federal agencies. And in here you can see, if you look on the right side, examples of how to do social impact analysis, how to do monetary estimates of benefits and non-monetary estimates. There's modeling approaches built in here. So again, there's some takeaway in this framework that might be useful again for researchers around the world, even though this one in particular is tailored for national scale monitoring in the US. The last thing I'll say is that we have been reviewing this literature a bit and have been finding that ecosystem services work is variable in terms of how much is really being published out there, but there's quite a bit of work. And the reason I point this one paper out is just to mention that that bibliography is potentially quite useful for looking at methods and approaches of empirical case studies. So the one other point to mention in terms of focused research on urban ecosystem services is 4 journal special issues devoted to this topic. The first I mentioned is in the journal Ambio that came out last year, a recent one in the journal Ecosystem Services that came out this spring, and 2 more that are in process, one in Environmental Science and Policy that we expect to be completed by this fall, and another in Ecological Indicators that's in process for the spring. So with that, I'll either take questions now or later, and thank you for your attention. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Simon. This is David Maddox again. Simon, we have 2 questions for you that we'd like to address now.
Sure.
The first one is, how are the this comes from Arthur Getz Escudero. How are the wider contributions of ecosystem services at the city regional scale incorporated into your analysis? I think of New York City from this question came up. Beyond the city limits, what are the cross-jurisdictional processes that might be involved? And the second question is related. It comes from Ana Carolina Merdes, and that is, which computer program was used in the Kramer Expert paper?
Okay. If I understood the first question correctly, it's sort of what are we doing in terms of looking at regional scale contributions, and that's something that New York City has looked at for a long time in terms of water, at least. I mean, drinking water, sort of a classic case of a payment for ecosystem service plan that New York City was successful in developing the Catskill watershed to supply at the regional scale water to the urban core. Food is another really important one. Now, on the research side, we haven't really looked at that in a systematic way to really better understand the flows, what we might call the flows of ecosystem services from regional to urban cores. And I thank the participant for bringing up this question, because this is a crucial area of work that needs to be done, is to really better understand the flows of services, not only from the region to the city, but even from the city to the region, depending on the different ecosystem services. And just on the methods, the work that I was showing in New York is all analysis, geospatial analysis done within ArcGIS.
Thank you very much, Simon. Let's move on to social ecosystem services. We'll have a presentation from Lindsay Campbell. Lindsay Campbell is a research social scientist with the USDA Forest Service in Northern Research Station. She is based at the New York City Urban Field Station, a partnership between the Forest Service and the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation. Her current research explores the dynamics of urban politics, stewardship, and sustainability policymaking. She is the co-principal investigator on several long-term interdisciplinary research projects, the Stewardship Mapping and Assessment Project, or STEWMAP, and the Social Networks and Spatial Turf of Civic Governments and private actors working on environmental stewardship in New York City. A Living Memorials project examines the use of open space post-September 11, 9/11. Landscapes of Resilience explores the stewardship of natural resources post-disturbance in Gotham, Missouri, and New York City. She is a member of the NSF-funded Ultra X team examining changes in land cover, ecosystem services, and stewardship in New York City's urban forests. Dr. Campbell holds a master's in public policy from Princeton and a master's in city planning from MIT, and a PhD in geography from Rutgers University. Please welcome Lindsay Campbell.
Great. Thanks, David. I hope everyone can hear me. Thanks so much to URBIS and ICLEI for inviting me to speak today. As David mentioned, I'm a human geographer and I work with the U.S. Forest Service. I'll be presenting on research from the New York City Urban Field Station, which has been developed in partnership with my collaborator, Erica Svensson, and a number of other scientists that I'll mention throughout the talk. And just to situate my work, this partnership between the Forest Service and the City of New York, as well as 50 other civic, academic, and municipal partners, is really focused on improving quality of life in urban areas by conducting research about social ecological systems and natural resource management. So, of course, we're here today talking about ecosystem services, and that's one way of understanding human-environment relationships. As this audience likely knows, ecosystem services include provisioning, regulating, habitat supporting, and cultural functions of the natural world. Cultural ecosystem services are the non-material, non-biophysical benefits, including aesthetics, spirituality, recreation, education, cultural heritage and diversity, knowledge systems, and physical and mental health. And the cultural is often or sometimes overlooked or oversimplified because humans are sometimes excluded from our concept of the ecosystem. But particularly in cities, we are the dominant ecosystem engineer. So we can describe services as co-created by the interactions of people and environments. And I'm pleased that Timon already introduced this concept of co-creation. And in cities, this can occur anywhere from a single street tree to a vacant lot, to a shorefront, to a forest. So in seeking to understand that co-creation, much of our research focuses on civic environmental stewardship. So I see connections between my talk and the next URBIS webinar on citizen participation in stewardship. So I'll be listening in on that. We define stewards as groups that conserve, manage, monitor, educate about, or advocate for the local environment. So that includes a focus on land, air, water, waste, toxics, and energy. And we intentionally created this broad definition to explore all the ways in which groups are working to care for their local environments. And in particular, we've drawn attention to the role of civil society, including both informal civic groups and formal NGOs. These groups exist in large numbers across cities large and small and persist over time. They are social innovations that influence how urban spaces are designed, managed, and used. So while green infrastructure mapping is becoming more common in urban environmental planning and policymaking, the map you see at left is a map of parks, greenways, and community gardens in New York City. This project is unique in that it maps the actors that care for that infrastructure. So at right, you see a map of civic stewardship groups with dots representing the address of each group. And in creating this project, we were responding to biases and skepticism about whether there was a vibrant environmentalism in the city. as well as patterns we saw amongst funders who were simply cherry-picking certain groups to support them over others based on them being more visible or more vocal. So the goal of StewMap is to make visible both the gaps and the overlaps in civic stewardship with an aim of strengthening the whole system. So it's both a basic empirical research project and an applied tool designed to be used by public agencies, funders, and even stewardship groups themselves. So to create StewMap, we worked with Dana Fisher, now at the University of Maryland, to conduct a citywide survey of civic groups. We built our sample from the organizational partner lists from 20 different citywide and borough-wide organizations, the logos which you see at right. And this approach has now been replicated in Chicago, Baltimore, Seattle, and Philadelphia, with current projects ongoing in Los Angeles and San Juan. So through our network of collaborators, we're seeking to expand to other cities, including in the Global South. We recognize that while this began as an urban project, it has relevance to the suburban and fully rural areas as well. So we're interested in developing StewMap approaches for multiple contexts, as environmental stewardship is happening everywhere in localities around the globe. Oops, pardon me. We asked stewardship groups to map their self-described geographic turf. That could range from a single intersection of streets to a specific block or lot to an entire neighborhood or borough, however the group self-described the physical terrain in which they worked. And this map shows the overlay of all those stewardship groups citywide, giving us a picture of stewardship intensity. So we actually found that areas with very little open space, including industrial areas, had a high intensity of this public stewardship, including in the South Bronx, which is an environmental justice community, and the Central Brooklyn. And we found areas of less intensity of civic stewardship in suburban areas where there are more private single-family homes and private yards. So we can begin to see these socio-spatial patterns in stewardship and whether and how they might relate to the built environment. My colleagues Michelle Johnson and Dexter Locke are beginning to look at these spatial patterns across 4 cities to determine whether there are consistent relationships to environmental or social factors. We've also looked at the connections among stewards. Using social network analysis, we identify the linkages between government, civic, and private sectors to understand stewardship as a system. Overall, we found a broad and polycentric stewardship network in New York City that is a crucial piece of the governance of New York's urban nature. So from that data, we identified key organizations that serve as brokers or bridge organizations in the network. Working with James Connolly of Northeastern University, we conducted and analyzed interviews on these organizations' 25-year histories. And we found that approximately a dozen civic groups that you see listed at the right are playing a really crucial role in sharing information and resources in New York City. They cross sectors and scales and serve a brokering role between some of the smaller neighborhood informal civic groups and large citywide public agencies. So these groups are in essence building a multi-scaled governance capacity and building a more flexible, adaptive, and potentially resilient institutional structure. I'll now switch gears from stewardship to use. Some of our more recent research has honed in on the relationship between people and parks, particularly natural areas, meaning the woods, meadows, and wetlands that were set aside and not programmed for active recreational use. Our research question for this study is, what are the uses, functions, and values of parkland and natural areas as conveyed through people's behavior, descriptions, and narratives? Working with the New York City Parks Department and the Natural Areas Conservancy, a local NGO, we've documented the use and meaning of urban parkland in 39 parks, over more than 9,000 acres, and with more than 1,600 randomized interviews with park users conducted, with each park visited during a weekday, evening, and weekend. We used a mixed method approach. First, we divided each park into spatially explicit zones that guided the data collection. So those zones split the park in response to the infrastructure and land use happening on the ground. Then, within each zone, we triangulated 3 techniques: observed counts of human activities, photograph signs of prior human use, and randomize interviews with adult park users. In addition, our research teams conducted paired and group debriefs and wrote qualitative field notes for each zone and park. Here is a quick snapshot of the overall breakdown of human activities observed. In addition to supporting sports and recreation and walking, which are no surprise, we can clearly see that urban parks are highly social spaces that support the public coming together, as well as a wide range of other activities. And we can break this data down to show how activities vary across different parks and different age classes of users, which are valuable data that we're sharing with managers in a series of white papers and park profiles. Because we knew we would miss birders at dawn and the slow erosion of grass under feet that comes from visiting each park, or because we were visiting each park just 3 times, counts and photographs of signs of prior human use allow us to observe and account for these patterns. In addition, we're currently conducting visual and textual analysis of all the writings we observed in parkland, from graffiti to murals to signage, to discern key messages that are communicated by park users. In particular, we're examining evidence of informal rulemaking and environmental signage to understand how urban environmental subjects are being framed in these spaces. So we could potentially compare or contrast these analog writings to the messages in digital writings on social media that Timon showed in his slide. I think that would be quite interesting. This slide draws from the responses to the interview question, why did you come to this park? And at left are the primary themes that emerge. We found that urban parkland is a crucial form of nearby nature that provides space for activities, recreation, socialization, and environmental engagement, and supports social ties and place attachment. We see that these themes connect directly to the cultural ecosystem services defined by the MEA, particularly social relations, sense of place, aesthetics, recreation, inspiration, and spiritual values. Working with our postdoc, Heather McMillan, we identified some of the unique ways in which urban nature supports well-being. Urban parks support social, psychological, and spiritual needs of citizens by helping people connect with self, with others, and with a larger reality. So connecting with self occurs as park users seek out the refuge of woods and waterfront away from the dense urban environment. Because I'm a qualitative researcher, I'll share some quotes here. One user said, "No other place out here to read in peace and quiet without seeing a million people." Connecting with others occurs through socializing, such as barbecuing, picnicking, or talking on a bench, which we found in about 1/3 of park users we observed. And overall, more than half of the users visited parks daily or weekly. So these are parts of people's everyday lives. And a respondent said, quote, "We love this park. We're here 7 days a week. This is our second home. If there were 8 days a week, we'd be here the 8th day too." Finally, connecting with a larger reality refers to using parks to engage in spiritual practices. We found examples of park users engaged in ministry, evangelism, prayer, meditation, baptism, and making ritual offerings. Finally, this work does connect back to stewardship. We asked park users, are you involved in any groups that help take care of the environment? And overall, citywide, 15% of park users are also stewards. But perhaps of most interest are those respondents who said no, they're not, but shared with us other ways in which they engage, from civic engagement at church, to recycling at home, to picking up litter at parks outside the context of groups. We see that these respondents are already engaging with urban social ecological systems in their own way and their own time, but they might also be potential recruits for new programs and opportunities. If we want to strengthen the connection between people and the urban environment, we would do well to use these building blocks to meet people where they are in our outreach and programming. My hope is that sharing these methodologies and a snapshot of some of the findings has provoked your thinking about how you might analyze stewardship and engagement with the environment in your own cities across the globe. I have 3 quick lessons learned from these different projects. First, consider the social. Although public interest in the environment continues to grow and policies around sustainability and resilience proliferate, We cannot risk thinking about the urban environment as just green stuff. So while bioswales and street trees are crucial infrastructure, they need us. And it's our human ingenuity and the groups and the institutions that we build that have the lasting power to care for and create that infrastructure. Second, use reliable, replicable approaches. For the social assessment, the methodology was developed to allow for rapid gathering of observational data in a way that can be replicated in other sites and times. We're currently working to feed these data back to managers in real time to help inform their planning and programming. So these are field-based assessment data that really anyone can collect and that don't require remotely sensed imagery. For StuMap, our community of researchers is committed to making publicly available tools so that other cities can adopt and adapt our approach. We're currently working on a technical report that summarizes the method and updating a web portal to provide enhanced visualization of existing data. As well, we plan to continue the work in our existing cities longitudinally so that we can understand the way in which stewardship evolves and shifts over time. Third, visualize the unseen. StuMap began as an effort to recognize and amplify the important work of everyday civic stewardship that can often go unacknowledged, though it's so vital to the health and functioning of a resilient city. Similarly, documenting the patterns of use and social meaning of parkland in novel ways can provide managers with a new way of seeing and understanding the opportunities and challenges posed in urban parks. So in closing, I remind that any assessment of urban ecosystems or ecosystem services must include social dimensions, as again, we are the dominant species in our cities and the co-creators of those services. So I'd like to briefly acknowledge funders, co-authors, and collaborators here. Thanks for the time, and please visit the website of the New York City Urban Field Station to learn more about this research. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. I have a question for you right now, and that is from Arthur Getz-Escobedo. And the question is advocacy and impact on policy conservative nature also being traced or tracked as an extension of the social network boundary organizations? Do they reach out at other scales of policy, such as regional, state, federal policy?
I'm so sorry. I'm getting a big echo on the question, David. Could you type it for me? I couldn't understand you.
Let me ask the question again.
That's clearer.
Great. Is advocacy and impact on policy that you're talking about to conserve urban nature also being tracked or traced as an extension of the social network analysis that you've done, the boundary organizations? Do those boundary organizations reach out at other scales of policy, such as municipal, regional, state, or federal policy engagements?
The multi-scaled nature, I mean, we did bound our sample to groups that work in the city. They might have boundaries that extend into the region, but we didn't do a census of national or regional groups. Despite that, the brokers that we found are crossing sectors and scales, so we often found that they receive funding from national foundations or the federal government that they then sort of share either through technical assistance or small grants programs or through their staffing that then touches down to the neighborhood scale. So we definitely found these civic groups bridging scales, and I would imagine, you know, with an even larger sample that we would find even greater complexity there. And I'll just add that one really interesting piece we found, and this is in the Connolly paper, is this sort of bipartite role where these groups are flexible. They sometimes work with government on funding or programs, but they also sometimes turn around and litigate or sue or advocate and hold their feet to their fire. And so that's part of the flexibility in the system that I think is so novel.
Thank you. I'm sorry to say that Lena Chan is not going to be able to join us for technical reasons. So we open the floor to questions. So type your questions in, and we will answer them as they come along. I have a question for both of you, and that is, you both talked about tools that have been applied in various places, but many of them in New York City. If you had someone from other cities around the world were interested in applying these tools, how would they go about it? How difficult is it to use and stand up the tools that you've been talking about today?
Yeah, thanks for that question, David. Our goal with the Forest Service is always to create tools that can then be replicated and adapted and adopted. The social assessment itself really takes a lot of cues from rural development context of doing field-based rapid assessment. So I would say we in New York are learning from the rural and from techniques of observation that have been around for a long time. We make those protocols publicly available. We publish our methods. So really anyone with a group of interns and some time on their hand can gather these data. In terms of StuMap, it is helpful to have a bit of GIS expertise, whether that involves using free open access things like Google Earth, where you draw polygons, to more advanced ArcGIS. You know, we do want to create these spatial turf maps, but again, the survey tools and protocols are open access, and we hope that people will continue to tweak them and modify so we can learn from a community of scholars. So I think they're both highly adaptable techniques.
And StuMap has been applied in a number of other cities in New York. Where have they done that? And there's a website that you can go to.
I breezed through that, but yes, it's been replicated in Baltimore, Chicago, Seattle, Philadelphia, and currently it's ongoing in Los Angeles and San Juan.
San Juan, Puerto Rico.
Yes. In conversations with folks all the time that are interested in replicating from Newark to Detroit, so places where there's a bit less municipal capacity, colleagues in Mexico City. So anyone is welcome to contact me if they're interested in learning more about how they might do StuMap in their city. I can put you in touch with our team.
What would be the impediment that you would expect anybody to encounter first? Is there any particular impediment that people would have to overcome?
An impediment to doing StuMap?
Yes, right.
I would say that the first step of building the sample is the most time intensive, because no such list already exists, and that first stage is, you can think of it already as a product. So in New York City, we built an advisory group among the nonprofits and municipal agencies that were already working on urban greening to say, you know, let's open up and share our member data, not of individual members, but of groups that we serve and work with. And that involves a bit of trust building. Not everyone wants to share that information, but once you realize that visualizing it together can have a greater impact, I think people got on board. So you can't use existing national lists or tax rolls. You have to sort of build a custom list. I think once you've done it once, it makes repetition easier. We'll find out. We're going to do StuMap in New York in 2017, decadally. So I'd say that first step is a bit of a challenge. And then, like any social survey, you need to be persistent to get response rate. So it's not a model that can run by being fed with remotely sensed data. You have to gather this novel social data itself. But I continue to hear from public agencies that these data are used and have value when they're doing outreach or programs in particular neighborhoods. They search the map for who's working there, even though at this point our data are from 2007. So that to me is a testament that it has lasting value.
Tymon, how about you? How would people from other cities access the tools that you have talked about? I think we need.
Okay, there we go. Thanks, David. Yeah, so similar to Lindsay, we've been trying to make tools that we've been developing as open and accessible as possible. Most of these are in peer-reviewed journal publications, and so are available in the methods section, and we've tried to be as transparent as possible in in detail about how to basically reproduce exactly the processes we've gone through for assessment, mapping, and valuation, built more on the biophysical side in terms of starting with biophysical information primarily for that assessment. So in some of the papers I briefly mentioned, but again, happy to send around things in case people don't have access. Sometimes different groups don't easily have access to journal articles. So we've tried to make those available in different places. For example, all of our articles are hosted on urbanecologylab.com. And so if there's a particular set of methods, it can certainly point you to the right place to look for those. So that's one thing in terms of trying to be transparent about the methods. I think you also had a question about how easy it is to do what we've done in New York as an example. And it does take a bit of technical expertise, especially in terms of using GIS-type software for mapping, but also the statistical analysis has been very geospatial in nature, meaning it's spatial stats. And so that requires someone with some expertise to be able to sort of handle that. So if this is, say, a small nonprofit organization, sometimes they don't have the same capacity as maybe municipal scale or researchers and academic institutions to be able to provide that level of expertise. On the other hand, we'd love to help people who are struggling with that as much as we can, as much as we have capacity to. But I think that's something where some technical expertise is necessary to do ecosystem services assessment. And for every ecosystem service, the process is different. So that's another challenge there, to try to look at co-benefits, multiple benefits, requires a good understanding of, for example, looking at stormwater runoff, of how to model stormwater runoff. In our case, we used hydrology models and runoff curve numbers from the USDA to calculate that for different kinds of land covers, but we also had to have data on soils, which not everyone has. So data can be a limitation. That said, there are sort of low data, low resolution entry points, and I think we just all have to be practical, that you get out what you put in to some extent in terms of these sort of modeling and assessment tools.
Here's an important question from Alessandro Altala from Melbourne. Here it is. In some cities, ecosystem services generated from the private realm are likely to outnumber those from public spaces. How can we measure them, particularly the social benefits, especially when these spaces are often not accessible to researchers?
That's a really good question. I'm sure Lindsay will want to jump in too, but I'll just say I think there are a number of studies that have been trying to get at that question to understand how access may be limited for various populations, underserved populations in the city that have limited ability to reap the benefits. So one thing I think both on the planning and management side that's important to recognize is that benefits occur often in a particular place. In that table that I put up about context dependency, we also tried for a number of services to think in multiple kinds of urban contexts whether or not a service was beneficial at a citywide scale, or was very localized, or both. And that really, again, depends on the different services. So the answer to the question is very much about which kinds of service we talk about, and yet we do know that there's a lot of inequity in terms of access to the benefits of urban nature, as the person who asked that question mentions. That in some cases, maybe certain private spaces have much more benefit. And we even see this in New York. I mean, the nicest, most well-cared for parks tend to be in very wealthy kinds of neighborhoods. And so that's a challenge, I think, for city planners, for activists, for nonprofit, sort of action-oriented kinds of organizations, is to really try to mobilize to increase the benefits in underserved areas and for underserved populations.
Lindsay?
Yeah, just to add a bit more on the private realm, I agree with Simon. It all depends on what service you're measuring, but I will say this is where remotely sensed imagery at whatever resolution can be very helpful for at least characterizing the condition of the built and green environment. New York City, like many cities, set a tree planting goal that began as a tree canopy goal, which they realized quite quickly from looking at remotely sensed imagery they could never realize just through planting on public lands and public right-of-ways. It would have to involve planting on private lands, and that's simply using urban tree canopy analysis that takes remotely sensed imagery and overlays the parcel data about where those trees occur, where there's physically space where one might possibly plant, and then you get into social valuation of where you want to or ought to plant based on what benefits you seek. Quickly, Timon mentioned, the iTree model. There are actually iTree plots that occur in people's private backyards, so the private realm is taken into account there. And then for understanding social values, there are social methods for reaching people in their homes, whether it's a general population survey through phone or mail, old-fashioned door-to-door or focus group work. There's a lot of work on the residential landscape coming out of the Baltimore ecosystem study from Morgan Grove, Dexter Locke, and then also Susanna Lerman at UMass Amherst. So people are quite interested in this question of how people are managing their private residential landscapes and what are the triggers that might drive them to shift those practices. So just because it's on private land doesn't mean we can't reach people where they are. Very important to consider, though. I agree. Thanks for the question.
We have one last question, and this is from Stephen Granger in Cape Town. This question is this: it's great to hear the value people are placing on green open space, but what tools are being used to ensure that these open spaces are safe and clean environments? Are there any examples of green stimulus factors, for example, by using taxpayer money to employ many people as visible policemen, quote unquote? These are key issues for cities in the global south.
I'm not sure about visible policemen, but the question or the interest in green jobs and sort of employing folks in caring for the environment remains of interest. After the last, the global economic collapse, there was a fair amount of stimulus money and funding going into trying to create these green job seed programs. As well, you have places like I mentioned in Detroit where the city's nearly bankrupt, and you have the nonprofit sector coming up to actually help care for the very basic green infrastructure and parkland that exists in the city, often through the vein of a green jobs and job training program. That said, more generally about making environments safe, we subscribe to the philosophy that the more used a space is, generally the safer it is. So a lot of these natural areas, it's when a site goes underused or under-maintained that it becomes unsafe. So understanding the patterns of use through something like a social assessment, developing a viable trail system that has signage and that's accessible and people can have wayfinding. I think some of those very basic natural resource management approaches are the way to make places lively and safe. And, building a community of stewards that cares for the space and creating sort of eyes on the street. It doesn't have to be policing. It's just people using and caring for the space that I think will ultimately make it safe.
Simon, anything to add to that?
Well, I think Lindsay covered that quite well, and she's much more the expert in terms of that area, especially around safe making. It's not an area I can speak to as much. I do think that there's a lot of work that is useful for making spaces visible and making spaces, and by visible I mean sort of visible to the average resident. When we talk about stewardship, but a lot of the potential stewards in terms of urban, people who live in the cities may not really even understand the benefits that nature provides or their importance to them, both as co-producers as well as stewards. Sorry, there's a bunch of noise right outside my office. I apologize for that. But I think that's just one aspect that's very important for us as sort of researchers, is to visualize the benefits, and that's where some assessment and mapping, and as Lindsay said, pretty simple approaches. It doesn't have to be that sophisticated in terms of some of the valuation work, but just to sort of visualize where the nature is, both through various kinds of mapping approaches that and ecosystem service assessment approaches, but also in terms of some of the really amazing things we've been seeing with sort of art science collaborations where people are decorating trees so that they're more noticeable, trying to overcome these sort of common sort of plant blindness that urban residents may have, to use art and performance and other kinds of ways to engage with the urban nature we have. And I think those are all important to, as Lindsay said, starting that process of making spaces safer by making them more heavily used.
I would add to this also that, especially in many cities around the world, there is a crisis of simply open space. For example, in Mumbai has 1/100th of the amount of public open space that New York City has. And so one of the problems many cities have around the world is simply the idea of where can these outdoor spaces, where are these outdoor spaces going to come from? How do people have access to them? And many of those private spaces have been blocked by private interests, so they're not really public spaces. That's a problem right around the world. One of the examples of important work in that regard is by P.K. Das in Mumbai, who's done a project called Open Mumbai to demonstrate where an open space mapping in Mumbai and who controls that open space. And that open data aspect of it has been really important in propelling a political dialogue about making spaces, making those kind of spaces more available to people, how to create those spaces. Really important. The Nature of Cities has some grant money now to pursue some projects like that around the world, and we're collecting some partners from cities around the world, and particularly in the Global South, to do a basic analysis of simple access to open space around the world. And Mumbai would be one of the target cities, and a number of other cities as well, which we're going to try to make some simple assessments of how many people have access to green and open space. On the belief that we talked about all today, that there are many benefits to these green open spaces, but in fact most people don't have it. Our belief is that this kind of data process will allow us to push a political dialogue forward. We have one last question for the day, and that is from Cecilia Herzog from RIA, and that is, can the panelists refer to ecosystem service studies specifically in developing countries or global south countries? Because those global south countries generally have very difficult realities and challenges than places like New York. Things like ecological, the tools for social ecological assessments and so on. What are some specific examples from the global south?
Sure, I can jump in for a second. And just before answering that question, I just wanted to echo your last comment, David, about vacant spaces. I think one of the papers that has some of the methods in it that we published in 2013, and we wrote about this in the Nature of Cities as well, as sort of the opportunities that are sort of latent in vacant spaces and the potential there. And we've had a lot of response from people all around the world, and especially in Global South, who have really been doing similar things to try to make more visible the vacant spaces in their cities. And I think that visibility is really crucial to the next step of transforming those to make them more beneficial to the people that live in and around them. And especially because a lot of these vacant spaces do turn out to be in lower income minority parts of cities. And so there's a real chance to sort of, as they say, kill two birds with one stone. That's kind of a rough image for a biodiversity crowd. But to both help address social equity issues while greening cities and providing all these other kinds of benefits. And I think increasing that visibility of vacant spaces is a really important one, and one that has even things like just putting them on a map and making the public aware of them is an important first step and relatively easy. This also gets to Cecilia's comment about what kind of work is done or can be done in the Global South. And some of the tools that we have are certainly available to be used in those kinds of contexts, especially since there's wide availability of slightly coarser remote sensing imagery that can help raise that visibility of what's green and what's not green, and what are the areas that really need to be better greened, and then helping to start the conversation about the kinds of interventions that cities or neighborhoods could have, whether it's tree planting, new park development, or vacant lot transformation. So I'll just mention, for example, that there's global 30-meter resolution remote sensing imagery that can be processed, or in many cases is processed into land cover, that is a starting point for the kinds of assessments that we've done. And colleagues of ours in China and in Europe have performed similar kinds of assessments to the ones that we've done in New York, using slightly coarser imagery but freely available remote sensing imagery that can be used for those kinds of assessments. And those are quite available in Rio and Sao Paulo and other places down south to be done and be processed in a very similar way. So at least on some of the biophysical aspects, the data's there, the methods are there, and I think there's some sort of easy lifting with a little bit of technical expertise to get some initial assessments off the ground in a lot of those places.
Thank you very much to the panelists. We'll end here. Thank you very much, Tony McPherson. Thank you very much, Lindsay. And thank you to Italy for hosting us here on the URBIS Dialogues. There will be the next URBIS Dialogues on the 3rd of September. It's on public participation in urban green areas. You can visit the website below on the screen and see more details about that, and also see past and future URBIS Dialogues. Thank you for participants who are attending and doing with us. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.